I'm Steve Clemons. I direct the foreign policy programs at the New America Foundation. Our partner in today's program is the New York University Center on Law and Security, whose executive director is Karen Greenberg. And 1 week from today, on October 17th, there will also be an all-day forum in New York focused on the Afghanistan dimensions of many of the themes that we've raised today. That will also air live on the internet, and we hope elsewhere. So without further ado, please welcome the co-producer of today's program, Karen Greenberg. Karen?
Thanks, Steve. Okay, well, for those of you who have stayed with us all day, congratulations. I promise to make this the most interesting thing you've ever heard, because there is nothing more interesting than hearing about how wonderful the NYPD is, which I am sure that everyone's going to talk about. So that's your teaser for what's about to happen. This panel doesn't really have a focus. Counterterrorism and American security, and so I'm assuming that that will also make it interesting, because everybody's going to talk about what they want to talk about. So let me introduce the panel, and then we will get on with it. Philip Mudd, whom we are delighted to have with us, is the Associate Executive Assistant Director of the National Security Branch of the FBI. He's been there since 2005. Prior to that, he was with the CIA as Deputy Director of the DCI Counterterrorism Center. He's been with the CIA for many years, more than 2 decades. But that's not an unimportant fact, given what we've been talking about in terms of the longevity of these groups and their own 2 decades in the business. And he is also, I'm not going to list all his awards, but this man has won an innumerable amount of awards from the intelligence agencies and from others for the work he's done. We've had him at our center events before, and he is a hidden treasure. Mark Sageman is currently at the NYPD, one of the more ingenious innovations of many of the New York Police Department. He's their first scholar in residence, and I think his role there is to help explain to the police department the trends in terrorism, the changing psychology of terrorist organizations. You probably know his books, Understanding Terror Networks and Leaderless Jihad, and I hope he has a lot of interesting things to tell us. Mitchell Silber is new to this convocation, and we're looking forward to hearing from him. He's the director of both the NYPD Intelligence Division's analytical and cyber units, and so I have no idea what he's going to talk about, but I'm looking forward to it. Michael Sheehan is a fellow at the Center on Law and Security. He is also a fellow at the West Point Counterterrorism Center, which you heard from before. Mike has a rather distinguished past and can speak to this panel and to you from both the international, the federal, and the state and the city level. As you probably know, he was the head of the New York City Police Department's counterterrorism division for many years prior to coming to the center and doing all the other things he does, including being a commentator at NBC. Prior to that, he worked at the UN as one of their peacekeeping ambassadors. And maybe he'll explain to you what peacekeeping actually meant in those days. And prior to that, he worked in the White House, both under the George H.W. Bush administration and with William Jefferson Clinton, also in the role of counterterrorism, and he was our first ambassador at large in this era for that. So without further ado, oh, and we have a new panelist that we didn't know was coming, but Joe Zogby, who I think you in Washington know better than I do. He's chief counsel to Senator Dick Durbin. Prior to that, he was staff director of the Subcommittee on Human Rights and Law at the Senate Judiciary Committee. And prior to that, he was former special counsel of the post-9/11 discrimination for the State Department. The order today, gentlemen, is going to be Phil, Mark, Mitch, Joe, and Mike. So, time to get started.
Thanks. You all hear through this? Is this working? I personally couldn't stand the memory of Fran Townsend behind the podium here. So, and by the way, where's Peter Bergen? Before I start, Peter, you know, hidden treasure until Peter Bergen lies to you and says, come to a small conference, invites 400 people, 72 journalists, and C-SPAN. I really appreciate it. I will never crawl out from under my intelligence rock again. Under what I thought was great leadership of a guy named Ambassador Jim Dobbins, a handful of Americans sat in a room in November of 2001 at Bagram Airfield north of Kabul and talked to President Rabbani of Afghanistan. And I was in that room as a CIA representative to Ambassador Dobbins. And I remember sitting there to this day, and to the day I die, I'll remember what I was thinking. I had participated as an analyst for a short time in the Covert Action Program to support Afghan rebels in the early 90s. I remember thinking, okay, remember November 2001. We've forgotten a lot of the intensity of what we felt back then. I remember thinking, Kandahar's not gone yet. The Soviets got bogged down here. Anthrax had just happened. We weren't sure where al-Qaeda was going next. About 1 million threat reports a day. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is going to be rough. I want to give you a quick picture of both the threat that has continued from al-Qaeda Central, from sort of an insider's optic, but also give you a picture of things we didn't understand then. Specifically, threat to the homeland, the homegrown issue that you all have talked about and what it means. And I'm going to try to do that in 10 minutes or less. The picture, I think, of the al-Qaeda Central threat is pretty straightforward. The homegrown threat is not. Straightforward in the sense that operational leadership moved east, they found safe haven, and they do one thing for a living. We still get consistent threat reporting indicating that they are not only plotting against the United States, but that despite their interest and the energy they use to get back into Afghanistan, despite the pressure from us and the Pakistanis, that they continue to train Westerners to come back. Fairly common in the inbox in the morning, we get briefed between 7 and 7:10 a.m. Our threat reports that relate to a threat that I think you would have recognized in 2001. Some things have remained constant, and that is safe haven allows people to plot. I don't think we would have anticipated how much safe haven they would have won in the tribal areas. They are embedding in ways I don't think we anticipated then. First, someone mentioned this earlier, they're actually marrying into tribes now. It's not just a question of them being hosted, it's a question of them digging down into the soil in ways that are not just operational, they're social and cultural. If we don't solve that problem, we will be hit again. Some of the ways that central threat evolved, though, I did not anticipate. Let me give you two big pieces. The first is ideological. I don't think any of us could have understood the ideological implications of this conflict 7 years ago. But remember something important, because today we talked about the operational threat. Remember that this is a group that was meant to spark a revolution that returned to a caliphate and that came back to a golden age. It was not simply a group that was designed to use the tactic of terrorism for no end. I would argue that the operational threat has maintained because the group has won safe haven, the ideological threat has declined. Why? Talked about polling data. You look at Pew Research polling data of Muslim countries, every country virtually they poll. Support for bin Laden and support for suicide attacks has declined. Important point, by the way, virtually every one of those countries that's polled has itself suffered an attack. Al-Qaeda has made the same mistake, and Islamic militants have again and again. Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and I think now Pakistan. They're killing too many innocents. I didn't anticipate, in some ways, the decline of the ideology. You saw evidence of that when Zawahiri was out in the spring defending himself on the internet. I thought it was a very defensive series of exchanges. People defend themselves when they feel vulnerable. I believe the organization understands that as we think about operations, and they think about operations, their ability to continue operations long-term, decades or centuries, these are people who think in terms of centuries, is declining, not because they don't have an operational capability, but because they're losing hearts and minds. Why did they tell Zarqawi, don't go after the Shia, go after the Americans? What happened? I don't think the awakening folks liked us. I think they got ticked off at the foreigners coming in and killing Iraqis, partly. Another thing's happening that I did not anticipate. When you look at safe havens, places like Somalia, in the tribal areas, we think in terms of a spectrum. Central al-Qaeda, people like Muhammad Atta, who conducted attacks of 9/11, or homegrowns. People who grow up in places like Birmingham or Atlanta, Georgia, and who read the internet. There is a phenomenon as these safe havens continue of, and I'll try to coin a phrase, what I would call self-recruited people, people who show up in these safe havens from the West, typically youth, who aren't terrorists, but who are looking for another way. They don't know what they're going to do when they get there. Think a little bit of the American Taliban, John Walker Lynn. They don't know what they're going to do when they get there. They're not terrorists. They go to study. They go to learn. I worry about these people. They're going to come home again. I don't know how. Somewhere in between a homegrown and an al-Qaeda central. So we face a persistent threat from al-Qaeda. They continue to plot, and they will as long as they have safe haven. They will not go home again. Interesting research has been done about contrast between the persistence of religious insurgencies and the persistence of, for example, political insurgencies. This is a religious insurgency, but I am arguing that it's declined in its ability to project a revolution, even while it's maintained its ability to operate against us. Quickly, let me transition, then close to the homegrown problem. I think this issue of ideology and this issue of the disparate nature of the ideological threat has implications for the United States. Who do we see here in the United States, and how do we understand them? And by the way, there's a behind-the-scenes cooperative effort among security services, American, European, Middle Eastern. We all talk about these things. Surprisingly enough, with all the differences in our populations, there are similarities. Quite simply, the people we're seeing today, in my judgment, many of them, I'm not talking about the rare al-Qaeda Central case. We're seeing parallel threats here, al-Qaeda Central and people who are inspired by the movement and by the ideology, but have never touched al-Qaeda. Let me talk about the latter for a moment, and commonalities. They don't know much about religion, and therefore they're more often driven by emotion than they are by ideology. This means, for those who are looking at this issue of de-radicalization, in my judgment, they're more prone to de-radicalization. Emotion is easier to turn around than a deep-seated religious ideology. They don't understand the core of the ideology they believe they're fighting for. Operationally, I would argue, they're less capable than people who are either al-Qaeda core or are connected to al-Qaeda core. That obviously offers opportunities for people like me. It also offers vulnerabilities. When you move away from a hierarchical organization to a dispersed organization, very inefficient way to do business, very inefficient to try to hunt 100 people who aren't connected, or 1,000 people, or 10,000 people who aren't connected to central leadership, don't have central communications apparatuses, don't have central vulnerabilities. So there are advantages and disadvantages. I would argue they're not cells. I think it's NYPD, and I give a lot of credit to NYPD for doing some great analytic work, who coined the term clusters. These are people, I mean, I don't watch TV, but this concept of cell is misguided in what I see day to day. These are people who don't know what they're going to do when they get into it. They often, and I think Mark Sagem or someone taught me that everything, by the way, I tell you, is stolen. I'm a CIA guy. I took it all from someplace else. They're people who, we think people get radicalized and then recruited. Often they're in not organizations, they're in clusters of groups, typically youth who are vulnerable, whether it's to goth ideology in this country or to jihadism, and they bounce off each other, figure out what they want to do, and slowly they are recruited and then radicalized often. Often not ending up any place, often not knowing when they start what they're going to do, or if they're going to do anything. So let me close with a quick picture of where we might be if we ever do a, what do you want, 3.0, 4.0, whatever it is. I don't do computers either. I'm sort of illiterate. First, I would argue we need to think about this issue of revolution. This is sort of the, I'll make it the al-Qaeda 1.0 of revolution. This is an organization, again, that wanted to spark a revolution. While there's a meaningful debate among experts about al-Qaeda's ability to direct attacks against the United States, about the significance of al-Qaeda core, I'm guessing if we poll this audience, there is an increasing consensus that the ability of this organization to spark a revolution has declined. What they wanted to do is not going to happen. So down the road, I think we have to worry about focus against an al-Qaeda central organization operationally and focus on safe haven. I think we should be cautious of getting into the ideological debate because they're killing themselves. The fact that you have senior people in Saudi Arabia and Egypt who are respected in jihadist movements getting out and attacking the organization is telling. And it's telling because al-Qaeda told us it's telling. Zawahiri's out there defending against it. And meanwhile, in this country, what we're dealing with is not a phenomenon of jihadists, it's a phenomenon of misguided kids who think they're jihadists. We've transitioned from revolution to terrorism, from jihadists to misguideds, from strategy to tactics. Note, when you talk about UAE and Yemen, They're either attacking or thinking about attacks as revenge, not as the kind of strategic approach that they took on September 11th. They attacked an economic, a military, and attempted to attack a political target, the three pillars of American power, so we would remove ourselves from the Middle East and they could directly go against the Saudi, Egyptian, Algerian, and other regimes. Now they're attacking out of revenge. That ain't strategy, that's tactics. I'm hopeful in terms of the ability we have to defeat a revolution. We have a long way to go in terms of our ability to defeat misguideds. From a security perspective, it's very difficult to go after this target. It's very inefficient. And in that sense, we have a contrast. This is my final point. The contrast is, as this debate moves out of the American center, in some ways, because of successes, the resources it takes to fight this war, and this is not a defense, I think this is an analytic judgment, the resources it takes to fight this campaign may become greater because we're fighting a diffuse movement of people that can't be targeted through looking at any hierarchical organization. It's in Atlanta, it's in Miami, it's in Los Angeles, it's in New York, it's in Washington, it's in Baltimore. We got a long way to go, but have hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Mark? Yep.
Well, you are heroes, staying here for the whole day. Anyway, I salute you and thanks for having me. Great. I basically want to talk about two things. You know, we talked about a lot of things today, but it's really kind of, there is no theme to kind of unite what we've talked about. So I basically want to understand the enemy and to try to see patterns so that those patterns, that understanding would then drive policy in our strategy. So I want to talk about radicalization and evolution of the threat. Radicalization, I basically mean the path to political violence. It's a behavioral definition. It's not so much what's in people's head, it's what they do. And we have to correlate what's in their head and what they do, but we can't just assume that we know. And the dynamics is really the dynamics of, you know, any kind of political party, any kind of revolutionary party, terrorist party, or anything like that. It's young men dreaming dreams of glory, chasing thrills, having a sense of belonging to other people like them, and of course the cause. It's a bottom-up process, and it has basically 4 prongs, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit. The first, Phil is absolutely right. It's about emotion. First and foremost comes the emotion. The emotion is one of moral outrage. This has been neglected in the literature. I don't understand why, but when you talk to people, they usually are outraged. This is what drives them. And the outrage could be both global, here for an intervention, for instance, or it could be local, the representative of the states, what they do to them or to their communities. And by moral outrage, large moral violation, killings, rapes, arrests. And the global and the local actually work together to almost activate a collective identity, in this case, a Muslim collective identity. The second prong is the frame. The frame is a very simple one here. The frame is really what interprets whatever they see, and here it's simple, it's a war on Islam. That's very much how they see the war on terror, and that, you know, that's a soundbite frame. It is not about disquisition about the Quran or anything like that. Most of the people arrested in the last 2 years, 3 years in Europe, or even Saudi Arabia, really know very little about religion. They're not intellectual, and they're not the type of people swayed by religious arguments. And actually now, many of them are kind of swayed by a very new variant, the Takfiri variant of this ideology. And it's a very simple variant. It just says that Muslims are not true Muslims. The only true Muslims in the world are the 100 people like them around the world. So it's great because you can absolutely reject every other interpretation of Islam. And so it's not really about a dialogue about what Islam is. They really reject that. But within this frame, the frame is actually embedded in other beliefs. And here is where the United States is a little bit different from Europe, namely that the American dream and the melting pot, whether it's true or not, doesn't matter. People actually believe it. It actually has partially protected us as opposed to Europe, where, of course, those things don't exist, and it's really mostly a politics of exclusion. The third prong, the reason why the frame, namely it's a war on Islam, sticks to some people is that it resonates with the everyday experience of life. And here is where you have a wide variation, because we don't have a Muslim community. We never do. We never did. They're always Muslim communities. It's really very small. It's all local. Whoever said that earlier, it's absolutely right. And we have a lot of wide variation, and people actually do join the movement for different reasons, because they have different grievances. And here again, Europe is very different from the United States. For instance, just looking at labor market, the labor market among Muslims in the United States, we have basically a slightly lower unemployment rate than the average unemployment rate in the United States. And if you look at an average American Muslim family, I think that the average income is about $70,000. The average American family was $48,000. This was before the crash in Wall Street. I have no idea what it's going to be next year. But in Europe, it's of course the exact opposite, where the unemployment rate among young Muslims is about 3 times the national average in that same group. And of course, you have children of unskilled labor, so it's very low socioeconomic status. And of course, you also have a political contribution here. You have a lot of people on welfare. Immigrants get a disproportionate amount of it, and this kind of creates a nativist backlash, which of course escalates hostilities between the two movements. So Atwan was absolutely right earlier on when he talked about his experience, his son's experience in Britain. The fourth prong, but that's still not enough. You have a lot of angry young Muslims. What really tips them is really group dynamics, and you have this mobilization to networks of trust. And how do those networks form? It turns out it's mostly a diaspora phenomenon worldwide. More than 80% of the sample that I had were part of the diaspora. In Europe, it's more than 90%. And again, the way people form groups, it's really an extension of everyday life. It's really your friends, the people you hang out with, your family, so you have 70% friends and 20% kin. And it's all self-selection. I know the NYPD likes to use the word cluster. I like to use the word bunch of guys. It's the same thing, basically. It's what Phil actually talked about before, spontaneously self-forming groups that travel together along this path. It's all self-recruitment. You have mutual proselytism. In the old days, where you actually could go to Afghanistan, about 15% were accepted into Al-Qaeda. It's very similar to applying to Harvard. You know, Harvard does not need to recruit. People want to go to Harvard. Al-Qaeda doesn't have to recruit. People want to be Al-Qaeda. And the acceptance rate is basically the same. At Harvard, 13%. Al-Qaeda was about 15%. I don't know what it is in the FBI. They must be much more selective, right?
Reject you?
No. I'm sure you would, actually. And again, no brainwashing. It's all about jihadi cool. It's about adopting this culture, this youth culture. In terms of mobilization through networks, as I said, at first it was very much face-to-face, young gangs, student, expatriate groups, religious study groups, but now things have moved. They have evolved, and it moved, there's now a gradual shift online. And we see a lot of the interactivity, no longer face-to-face, but virtual interactivity. And that kind of transforming the threat. You have now more women and more teenagers joining this movement. And it also links the people locally who may be dispersed to this global movement and gives it vision and guidance. But the real the center of gravity of this play, where the action takes place, it's really the chat room, and this becomes the virtual invisible hand organizing terrorist activities worldwide. And it's all by group dynamics, namely increased interactivity, which leads to increased commitment, and the group as an echo chamber encouraging mutual escalation of grievances, and soon they're willing to sacrifice themselves for their buddies, develop a collective identity and the cause which provides a script of how they're going to do that. And you have the slide into violence, in-group love, and out-group hate described in social psychology. So it was interesting that after I wrote my first book, turns out that everything that came out of Europe seemed to undermine my data. And so I was a good scientist, and at first I ignored it. But it became so overwhelming that you couldn't totally ignore it. And finally dawned on me that the threat evolved over time. The first wave were really the people who were in Pakistan in support of their Afghan brothers to fight the Soviet. And they formed very strong friendship, and that became the leadership of Al-Qaeda Central. Those are the Afghan Arab, Egyptians predominate here. Those were elite, and the average age of joining was about 30. The second wave were the graduate students of the 90s, again, fairly well educated. And what they wanted to do, they were inspired by the elders. And they went to Afghanistan in the hope of being chosen to be recruited into Al-Qaeda. So they were really self-recruit. Mohammed Atta went to Afghanistan in the hope of being chosen into Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda did not go to Hamburg to recruit him. It's all very much a bottom-up phenomenon. And those, again, are they formed the cadre, they're incorporated into Al-Qaeda, and they're still very dangerous. Now, both the leadership and the cadre are in the Afghan-Pakistani border. You heard about that quite a bit today. There was a transition phase between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, where the people who actually knew those guys in the second wave decided to get involved. And most of what we saw in Europe in terms of the major operations came from this transition phase, the Kravis case, the Overt case, Sauerland case. The third wave is very, very different. It's kind of the opposite from them, which is why the data from Europe really contradicted whatever I had before. And those are basically young wannabes who actually want to emulate their heroes, and they try to connect with Al-Qaeda, but they're having a lot of trouble because if they had a good time, we also could find an easy time, we could find Al-Qaeda as well. But those guys are so different from the other one. They're low class, not religious, they don't know much about religion. The average age of joining is now 20, they're poorly educated. Those are basically youth gangs with a high level of criminality, about 35%, whereas the previous one did not have much criminality. So you see the wave of terrorism, the people who are entering it have degraded over time. The third wave is what I call the leaderless jihad. And in a sense, it evolved in a Darwinian fashion. You have the same process of radicalization, which is the engine driving this thing, spouting clusters of young people wanting to be Al-Qaeda. But the environment, the habitat became very hostile, but enabled by the internet, you have this disconnected clusters all over the place. And this happened in an organic way, and it's basically a Darwinian growth in a hostile habitat. Now this threat, the last threat, is actually self-limiting. As people said, there was no state-sponsored. They basically antagonized a lot of the people who were predisposed to help them. They are unable to discipline the people that they don't know are joining the movement, and therefore it will decay for its own internal reason. So what are the policy implications here? And I'm going to conclude talking about that. The first two waves, there's no doubt about it. You got to eliminate them. You have to eliminate the leaders, you have to eliminate the cadre, you have to eliminate the transition network. And we've done a fairly good job. That part of Al-Qaeda is contained to Pakistan, Afghanistan. It really has now trouble projecting out of that. We have to deny sanctuary. Sanctuaries are very important. And this may be the only military mission. But the third wave, the strategy, because it's so different from the first two waves, the strategy has to be completely different. Here it's a containment strategy and, of course, accelerate the process of internal decay. So the main goal is to prevent the radicalization of the next generation, namely take the glory out of terrorism, because that's really what's one of the major aspects that drives those young people, develop an alternative youth culture. We also have to reframe the debate here. The war of ideas is not just a war of ideas. It's not just about talking, the Quran says this, the Quran doesn't say that. No, no, no. We have to reframe this completely. This is about victims. It's not about the perpetrators themselves. Just remember the Holocaust. When people think of the Holocaust, they think of the victims first. Then they start, way down, think about the perpetrators. Here it's quite the opposite. When people talk about terrorism, they think about terrorists first. They should think about, we should reframe it in terms of thinking about victims. So when we have a press conference, we talk about the victims, not the perpetrators. And we have to counter the process of radicalization in terms of decreasing moral outrage, a smaller footprint in Iraq, reduce local moral violation by the police. On second, we have to challenge the frame war on Islam by concentrating on victims. We have to teach people the benefit of immigration. On the third, we have to reduce discrimination in labor market and racism. I mean, let's be realistic. This is what's happening in Europe right now. European countries are really fighting hard to fight it, so I have to give them credit, but there is much more of that there than here. And on the fourth one, it's very simple. Eradicate local terrorist networks, and this is a law enforcement and also a lot of coordination with other law enforcement agencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark Sageman. We're going to turn to Mitchell Silber.
I guess our indoctrination efforts are working, Mark. I heard clusters at least 2 or 3 times. Well, I'm going to be discussing radicalization in the West and the implications for America going forward. And, all right. The NYPD believes that the nature of the terrorist threat to the United States has evolved since 9/11. 9/11 was both the hallmark al-Qaeda attack as well as the singular exception. Plots in the West since 2000, both those successful and those thwarted, fit a different paradigm. The individuals who were involved with these plots were for the most part all citizens or residents of the states in which the attacks occurred. And though a few may have received training in al-Qaeda camps, the majority did not. Although al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for each attack after the fact, these attacks were not under the command and control of al-Qaeda Central, nor were they specifically funded by al-Qaeda Central. Rather, they were conducted by local al-Qaeda affiliates, local residents and citizens who used al-Qaeda as their ideological inspiration. This is the homegrown threat, and it's driven by radicalization in the West. And if you look at this schematic, you can see that 9/11 sort of stands alone at the top of the chart for al-Qaeda command and control. You see a cluster of UK plots sort of in that middle area, and really many of those plots, I know we've talked a lot about al-Qaeda plots beginning early in the day, but in many of these cases you had UK citizens of Pakistani descent who traveled to Southwest Asia to go to Kashmiri camps. Jaish-e-Mohammed, Harkat-ul-Mujahideen, and some of these individuals then may have met people linked to al-Qaeda, provided them with supplies, night vision goggles, and then decided to come back to the UK to plan a plot. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was an al-Qaeda command and control. Once you get past that, though, you see a number of plots. Madrid, the Hofstede Group, Sydney Milbourne in Australia, the Pendennis plot, Toronto, New York City's own Herald Square subway plot, as well as Fort Dix. And these all fit this model. Well, the reason why we believe that this is the case is that the police commissioner sent out a team, myself included, to all the cities here. And what we did is we went and we met with law enforcement and intelligence officials, and we spoke to them not necessarily about the components of the bomb or how it was put together, but we spoke to them about how did these individuals change? How did they radicalize? And what we did is we dissected all of these different plots. Whether it was the Hamburg group, who ended up being the pilots for 9/11, to Lackawanna, and understand the 6 individuals who went to Afghanistan camps. And what we did is we dissected each of these plots and sort of lined them up against each other to find out how did these people change. And what we found was that there was a common radicalization pathway. So what was that pathway? Well, number one, it starts out with individuals. And these individuals, there's no profile of who's likely to go down this path. In fact, most of these individuals are unknown to law enforcement and in a sense are clean skin. And in fact, they're unremarkable. And in this sense, many of our findings dovetail with Mark's findings. But what drives these people? Well, to some degree, it is ideology. And ideology frames the issues. It provides a justification for action that motivates young men born or living in the West to carry out violent jihad against their host countries. And when we look at some of the gateway ideologies, Salafi ideology, Islamist ideologies, these may start out benign, but for those who continue on this pathway, ultimately there's a violent component to it. That said, there are phases to this process. People don't change overnight. And in fact, each one of these phases is unique and has specific signatures. Most of the individuals who begin this process don't necessarily pass through all the stages. In fact, it's like a funnel. And many stop or abandon this process at different points. Although this model suggests that it's sequential, individuals do not always follow a linear progression. This is a human behavior model, and people are going to bounce back and forth. But, most importantly, individuals who do pass through this entire process, we believe are quite likely to be involved in planning a terrorist act. And this is just a little bit more of a detailed schematic of the process. And again, some of our findings, stage 1, who are these people before they even begin this process? And this again dovetails with Mark's findings. These are individuals living in the West of a young male demographic. They're middle class, they're educated, most of them come from a secular background, so no real profile in a sense beyond that. But something happens, some type of catalytic event, political, they look overseas and they have this moral outrage, economic discrimination, where they perceive there's discrimination, and they change their viewpoint of the world. They try and find out who are they. They're not quite British, they're no longer Pakistani anymore, they're second or third generation. There's no such thing as a hyphenated identity, a British Pakistani, but they know they're Muslim. But they may not know what that means, so they begin in a sense being a seeker, trying to find out what does their heritage mean, and unfortunately many of them get on a pathway that takes them on a Salafi or Islamist type of ideology. And we see changes in behavior during that self-identification phase. At a certain point, there's an acceptance of this ideology for those who are going to continue down this pathway, and in fact, they actually withdraw from the mosque. It's not extreme enough for them. There's not enough political rhetoric in the mosque. And in fact, they separate from society, and maybe the only window they leave open is the internet, where they're interacting with people around the world who have the same viewpoint as they do, and in a sense, it's a virtual echo chamber. And then in the final stage, they commit to actually being involved in a violent attack. And they may go overseas looking to fight in a legitimate field of jihad, and they may come back to the US, back to the UK. There's also training that's available in the West, whether it's in Australia going out into the bush and going hiking, or if in the UK going whitewater rafting, or if you're in Fort Dix, New Jersey, going up to Goldsboro, Pennsylvania, and using weapons and going to shooting ranges. There's mental preparation, and then lastly, there are acts in furtherance. Well, what else do we know about this process? Is this a process that's growing? And I think it's insightful to look at some of the UK numbers in terms of the last couple years. In 2001, the UK said that there are about 250 Islamists who were under investigation for links to terrorism. By 2004, that number had jumped to 500. At the end of 2006, it was 1,600, and 1 year ago, in November '07, it was 2,000. So basically, 16-fold increase in 7 years. So that's why Peter Clark from the Met says that this process is happening faster, and it's happening to younger individuals. When you look at this plot of Al-Qaeda 3.0, we believe that there are really two important centers of gravity. One that we've talked about for most of the day in terms of being Southwest Asia, both sides of the Durand Line, the Fatah, the tribal areas of Pakistan. But really, the individuals who we're seeing involved in many of these plots come from the West. They come from Western Europe. They come from Canada. They come from the United States. And whether it's the shoe bombers, Operation Rhyme, or Crevice in the UK, individuals from Amsterdam, from the Hofstede Group, people from Australia in the Pendennis plot, this process repeats itself where individuals travel to Southwest Asia. That said, it's not only a European or a Canadian phenomena. The Lackawanna Six went to Al-Qaeda training camp in 2000. The 7 members of the Virginia paintball plot went to Southwest Asia to LET camps. Individuals from the Portland plot went to Southwest Asia right after 9/11. So this process keeps repeating itself. One important part of this, though, is that this travel to Southwest Asia for training is a sufficient but not a necessary condition for being involved in a terrorist plot in the West. And when you look at what does one get by going to Southwest Asia, going to the tribal regions, well, plot blueprint, sure. When the guys from Hamburg went, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had the plot on the shelf, and now we had westernized individuals to carry it out. Military training, individuals from Lackawanna went to an Al-Qaeda training camp. Recruitment, you might have gone there to go to a Kashmiri camp like Deir and Barrow, but at a certain point you got linked up with individuals who were associated with Al-Qaeda. Indoctrination, members of the Crevice plot in the UK, this was the aluminum nitrate plot. These individuals went to a camp that they set up themselves, and they basically indoctrinated themselves at this camp. Skill development, the 7/7, 7/21 plots, learning how to make explosives, financial assistance. 9/11 sort of stands alone as being funded by Al-Qaeda Central. Command and control, having Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh issuing directions and commands from Southwest Asia. Material, an individual, Mohammed Junaid Babar, a New Yorker from Queens who brought back aluminum powder from Southwest Asia. Or sanction, Deir and Barrow, the individual who cased out the IMF and World Bank in Washington and the Citicorp building and New York Stock Exchange in New York, went there to provide, looking for sanction for plots. But if you look at this list of reasons why one would go, none of these actual things are necessary and can only be gotten in Southwest Asia. Each and every one of them can be found in the West, and when you look at a plot like the Madrid plot from 2004, in fact, no one did have to travel to Southwest Asia. So lastly, to conclude, what are the implications of this? Well, number one, I think that it's clear that the U.S. homeland will continue to face a persistent and evolving threat over the coming years. Number two, in terms of who are we concerned about, groups, clusters, bunches of guys, people who are radicalized in the West, who utilize Al-Qaeda as their inspiration. And they may or they may not have links to Al-Qaeda Central. Again, travel to Afghanistan and Pakistan can play an important catalytic role, but again, that's not a necessary condition. I think in terms of looking at the plots that have been directed towards the United States. In a sense, the UK has to be thought of as a central front in the war against al-Qaeda plots. You think about the shoe bomber plot, as I talked about earlier, Diran Barrow, a UK citizen who had cased out these targets in the United States, the liquid bomb or overt plot from the summer of 2006, all three of these directed at New York, at the United States, as well as the al-Muhajirun network, who two New York City individuals managed to get involved with and subsequently were arrested for. Radicalization is happening in the United States. I think because there have been a number of plots that have been discovered, people have been arrested. So I think we can be confident that this is a process that's not solely restricted to Europe and to Canada. And the last 2 points, Brian Jenkins, who wrote the foreword for our paper on radicalization, I will cite him for these two, in the sense that we have to worry about these plots from individuals who may have not gone to Southwest Asia. Madrid was more devastating and claimed more lives than a 7/7 plot, or in Oklahoma City. So the Southwest Asia piece, again, it's sufficient but not a necessary condition. And then lastly, how are we going to find these individuals before they travel to Southwest Asia or upon their return? And New York City had experience with this with a plot in 2004, the Herald Square subway plot. And one of the things that should be thought about as a policy implication is providing more resources to police forces who may be best suited to know their local environment and know their community and potentially uncover these plots ahead of time. Thank you very much.
In my personal capacity, I'm not speaking for Senator Durbin or for the Senate Judiciary Committee. I want to thank the New America Foundation and especially Steve Clemons for inviting me to be here today. I've long admired Steve and read his blog, and also want to thank the NYU Center on Law and Security and Karen Greenberg. Their work has been an invaluable resource to those of us on the Hill who work on these issues. I also want to say it's an honor to panel with all these distinguished experts. I agree with most of what has been said today, and of course we on the Hill want to do everything we can to support the efforts of the federal, state, and local government to combat terrorism. I do have a somewhat different perspective. I'm a civil rights attorney who specialized in law enforcement misconduct at the Justice Department. And on the Hill, I've been involved in many of the post-9/11 debates about counterterrorism and civil liberties. From the Patriot Act and warrantless surveillance to Guantanamo and interrogation and detention policies. I've had the opportunity to work with counterterrorism and law enforcement experts, but I've also had the opportunity to work closely with some of the communities that have been affected by our counterterrorism policies. And in the short time I have, I really just want to make one basic point that I hope we can all agree upon. In order to be effective, our counterterrorism policies must respect civil liberties and fundamental human rights. This is a lesson that we've learned in the last 8 years. You can pick your metaphor. Taking the gloves off, working the dark side, getting chalk on your spikes. The bottom line is policies that violate civil liberties undermine our counterterrorism efforts. Look at the evidence. Guantanamo is a recruiting poster for al-Qaeda. The image of our country is at an all-time low around the world. We have fewer friends and more enemies. In short, we're less free because of some of these policies, but we're also less safe. Let's take an example of one human rights principle that has been called into question by some. Equal protection under the law. It's fundamental in our constitutional democracy that people are not treated differently by our government on the basis of race, religion, or national origin. About a decade ago, the U.S. Customs Service had a problem with racial profiling. And my boss, Senator Durbin, asked the Government Accountability Office, then the Government Accounting Office, to do a study. And they discovered disturbing disparities in the rates at which African American women were being singled out for strip searches at airports. Raymond Kelly, who's now the commissioner of the NYPD, and at the time was the head of the Customs Service, did the right thing. He put new policies in place, training, discipline, and corrected the problem. By 9/11, a consensus really had developed that profiling on the basis of race, religion, national origin is unacceptable. I want to read to you what FBI Director Mueller said during his confirmation hearing, July 2001. Racial profiling is abhorrent to the Constitution. It is abhorrent in any way, shape, or form. After 9/11, that principle came into question. To take just one example, the Bush administration established a program called special registration, which required tens of thousands of innocent Arab and Muslim men to register with the INS solely on the basis of their national origin. Jim Ziegler was the Bush administration's first INS director, and here's what he had to say about special registration. And again, I'll read. This project was a huge exercise and caused us to use resources in the field that could have been much better deployed. As expected, we got nothing out of it. To my knowledge, not one actual terrorist was identified. But what we did get was a lot of bad publicity, litigation, and disruption in our relationships with immigrant communities and countries that we needed help from in the war on terror. I am concerned that we may not be fully taking to heart some of the lessons that we have learned. To take one example, Attorney General Mukasey recently issued new guidelines for the FBI that would allow surveillance of innocent Americans with no suspicion and in part on the basis of race, ethnicity, or national origin. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. I want to commend the NYPD for their work on these issues. I do find some elements of the study somewhat troubling. I haven't had a chance to review it in detail, but I do get concerned when we start to characterize innocent behavior of minority communities as suspicious, especially when it's based on a small and rather unrepresentative sample. To sum up, it is a fundamental tenet of community policing that law enforcement should work to build up the trust of the communities that they supervise. But counterterrorism policies that do not respect human rights and civil liberties have alienated many Americans, especially Arab and Muslim Americans, not to mention our friends and allies around the world. This has reduced cooperation, and it makes it more difficult to combat terrorism. It's also not consistent in some respects with American values. And in a war of ideas, what could be more important than that? Thank you.
Thank you, Joe Zogby. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Sheehan.
Thank you, Karen. You know, I don't like to do conferences and never do panels, but I came anyhow, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you also, Peter, for inviting me, and thank you for having me be the last speaker on a 5-person panel on a Friday before a 3-day weekend. It's what I really like to do. All right, what am I supposed to talk about today? What are we to do about all this? What we heard about today. And the only reason I did come, because so many of my friends and colleagues are here today, I did want to hear what they had to say, and they did have some new and interesting things to say, and I really appreciate it. What I think, there are 2 teams now and 2 would-be administrations that are both now thinking about what they're, in between measuring their curtains for their next office, they're also thinking about what they're going to do about this threat when they take office on January 20th of next year. And they're trying to figure that out. And I'll try to give them, either team, a few words of advice based on my time in this business, which really started in 1979 when I was in the Army Special Forces, and I was trained during the Iran crisis then to be part of a new counterterrorism unit. So I've been at this for a little bit of time from a couple different angles, and this is a couple thoughts of advice for them. I thought I'd break down my advice into two categories: what to do before an attack or to prevent an attack, and almost as importantly is what to do after an attack, because there will be another attack of terrorism of some sort of nature. So I'll break it down into those two categories. And oh, by the way, it would be much easier. I think there's time for nuance in understanding this threat and how we go about this business. And a lot of people think Americans aren't capable of having nuanced thought. And sometimes when you watch cable news, you can make that case. But I believe we are ready for that. And it would be much easier for me and much more fun if I were to come up here and say, Al-Qaeda is at the brink of destroying civilization as we know it. They will get nuclear weapons. They will create a biological weapon. They will be attacking us. We're at the brink of World War IV. And that's been stated before. And that would be great fun. And I could make that argument. I could also make the argument in saying that basically everything we've done since about middle of December of 2001 has been a grand waste of time, and that Al-Qaeda is spinning out off its own orbit into oblivion based on its own incompetence. I could make both of those arguments and have a lot of fun doing them. But I think it's somewhere in between, actually, and it's time for us to understand the nature of the threat, what it is and what it isn't, and how dangerous it is to either overestimate the threat or as equally dangerous it is to underestimate the threat. So that's the first thing I would recommend to a new administration, is get a handle on this, the nature of the problem, and to understand that Al-Qaeda, if left alone, they will kill you and in large numbers. However, under pressure, they are really collapsing their true operational capability. You know, Bill Parcells, a famous football coach, said about football teams, he said, you are what your record is. So let's look at Al-Qaeda's record, and I'm talking about the strategic Al-Qaeda, the one that attacks and kills Americans, one I'm primarily worried about, as perhaps if I were an American official. In 37 months, between August of 1998 and September 11th of 2001, Al-Qaeda attacked the United States 3 times, 3 strategic attacks in 37 months. That's about 1 a year. The East African embassies, 2 embassies got blown up, a $1 billion warship was almost sunk off the coast of Aden, and our 17-acre hole in New York City and the Pentagon was banged up. That is a significant strategic capability. 3 for 3. Well, in the last 7 years, they're 0 for 7. And you are, as Bill Parcells says, you are what your record is. Yeah, they've had a lot of plots, but they didn't score any touchdowns. They've had 2 successful attacks in the West. The London attack on July 5th of 2007 and the Madrid attack in March of 2004. And those were very significant and deadly attacks. Over 100 people killed in Madrid, over 50 in London. But again, that doesn't constitute World War IV. You're talking about 150 deaths in the West since 9/11 as a result of Al-Qaeda in 7 years. They're struggling in terms of their operational reach to the West, which is really what they wanted to achieve since around December of 1996. However, it's an organization that shows signs of great resilience and great capability. Obviously, they've shown that in Iraq with tremendous tradecraft, ability to operate bombs, conduct suicide attacks. Of course, they're kind of reeling in Iraq a bit, but they're still there. Afghanistan and Pakistan, rightfully so, the focus of this conference today is really the most troubling aspects of their resiliency and their intention to reach back out into the West and attack. So the nature of the threat, it's time for nuance, to understand that if an organization, if we don't put pressure on them, they will get back to that record they had prior to 9/11, 3 for 3. But under pressure, I believe that we can continue to marginalize them, not eliminate them, but marginalize them over the next 20 or so years, which I think they'll be around. So what works and what doesn't work in the business of counterterrorism? Now, I'm going to focus as a counterterrorism official on this on this, and I would advise the next administration to remain very, very focused. That doesn't mean, I don't believe that if you solve the Arab-Palestinian issue, you wouldn't improve the ability of folks like me in counterterrorism to get the job done. If you eliminated tensions between India and Pakistan and Kashmir, that it wouldn't help. That if you eliminated global poverty and had social justice and peace and democracy around the world, it would make my life a lot easier as a counterterrorism person. But you know what? Even if all that were accomplished in the next 5 years, there would still be a hardened group of people coming out to try to kill us. So I'd always remind them, while you're achieving all those broader objectives, stay focused on the primary objective, is to find the people that are trying to kill you and stop them. Now, what has been successful in doing that over the last 7 years? Why haven't they been able to attack us? I'd say there's 4 principal reasons. Number 1 is the elimination of the sanctuary of impunity in Afghanistan. That, beyond, in my view, beyond anything else, has been the most significant thing that we've done in the war against terror, if you want to use that term, since September 11th. And that's why I made the argument, really, since December of 2001, that was when most of the work was done. In the pummeling of that al-Qaeda central apparatus and its ability to project from there to the West. That is the single most significant thing, and that needs to be retained. And by the way, I used the term a sanctuary of impunity. I didn't say sanctuary, because they have sanctuary in many, many places around the world, and it's almost impossible to eliminate all sanctuary. But they cannot be allowed to have a sanctuary of impunity or allowed to sit in Afghanistan, plan, train, direct, and receive jihadis back from operations. That is a deadly situation, and Americans can never again tolerate that situation to exist. And we're getting very close to that in the tribal areas on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan now. And having lived through that situation when I was Ambassador for Counterterrorism in the State Department, watching that situation evolve in 1998, 99, and 2000, and watching all the excuses of why we couldn't deal with it then, we really have to make sure we don't allow ourselves to get caught in that situation again, or they will be back and they will kill in large numbers. So that sanctuary of impunity is very, very important. Secondly, counterterrorism about intelligence operations. And I would give a great deal of credit to the CIA in cooperation with intelligence and law enforcement agencies around the world that have dismantled al-Qaeda operations around the planet, from Jakarta to North Africa to Cairo to the U.S. to Hamburg to New York to Miami and through Europe. They've really put the organization under enormous pressure. And that, in my view, is the second most important. It's basic intelligence and law enforcement operations have really rolled up a tremendous amount of cells and what's left is a lot of wannabes that really can't take a plot from an idea through operation. There's only really been 2 in the West since 9/11, as I mentioned. Third, the intelligence operations at home in the U.S., I think, have also put a damper on al-Qaeda's ability to do anything in the U.S. I think they have a very difficult time recruiting here. I think the Islamic people that I come in contact with in New York City and around the country are much more interested in having their children be part of the American dream. They're having a very difficult time. But make no mistake about it, there are people in the United States that would like to do us harm. And the law enforcement efforts that we've taken against them, in my view, have had a chilling effect on their ability to operate. And that's a very, very important part of this equation. Finally, I would say a couple of different panels talked about movement. I believe that even though we know that our airports have trouble and we all like to joke about TSA, or we know that our borders are porous in Mexico, and as well as Canada, by the way, for a terrorist operative in the post-9/11 world, it is very, very difficult for them to move through the airport scrutiny around the world or any other type of movement. And that has given them tremendous problems. When they are able to move, like Mohammed Atta was prior to 9/11, like Mohammed Siddiqui Khan was able to do, the British guy who went back and forth to Pakistan, who did the London attack, if they are able to move, you're going to have problems. So those 4 areas, the Afghan takedown, proper use of military power and counterterrorism, intelligence operations around the world, intelligence operations at home, and the prevented movement, in my view, has crushed the al-Qaeda organization and made it very, very difficult for them to get the kind of track record they'd like to achieve, which means attacking us in the West. I believe they're in Afghanistan and Iraq because they can't get here. They would much rather be in the United States and Washington, New York, and other cities and attacking us. Let me spend 1 minute on my advice to a next administration in what to do after an attack, because they will attack us again. My advice is don't panic. And remember, it's been 7 years. And unless you have specific evidence that they're going to start attacking us every week or every month, assume it's going to be another 7 years. And this is very, very important because terrorism is an instrument of the weak. They attack your psychology. So if you overreact to a terrorist attack, you're playing straight in your hands. So if they attack us again tomorrow in Washington or New York City, and we set our collective hair on fire, and start allowing pundits that run around saying this administration, the other administration has failed, and the world is coming to an end, we're playing straight in their hands. We should take a page out of the lessons of the British and the Israelis that really know how to do this and how to react to terrorism. They've lived with terrorism for a long time. They get back to life right away. They clean up the mess. They get their economy right going again. The trains in London were running again in 3 hours after that attack. We shut down civilization for 4 days after 9/11, crippled our economy. The Israelis are famous for getting things going up again. Sends a message to the terrorists, your attack will not affect us. I think that's extremely important. Yes, we'll have to make corrections, see if there's a lot more out there. But it's very important not to overreact because you play into the hands of terrorists and their inherent weakness. So let me conclude by saying I hope, thank you for coming today, and we're down to the end of this long session with a lot of great ideas in it. And I think that those ideas contribute to my central message, that it's time for an understanding, a nuanced understanding of the threat, that they can be very, very dangerous, and they seek horrible weapons to kill us in large numbers, but they're also at the same time bumbling idiots that have failed to be able to attack here again in 7 years. They're both, at the same time, very, very dangerous and incompetent when under enormous pressure. We have to understand both of those facts. And we have to understand, secondly, that they probably will attack us again. Yet we should not fall into the trap of overreacting, not allow the cable networks and talk radio to dictate the way we respond to that attack, and respond as a mature adult nation to that attack. Get back on the job to recovery and going after those operational cells they can't attack us again. I believe we're ready for that as a country. And conferences like that, I think, contribute greatly to that. And again, I appreciate the group you were able to pull together, Karen and Peter, Steve, and others. It's been a great group. I learned a lot and enjoyed seeing a lot of old friends and colleagues. Thank you, and that's it.
Don't you get that we saved the best for last? Anyway, thank you. I have a couple of follow-on comments to Mike's presentation and some questions for the panelists, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. There's a connection here between the human rights perspective and the law enforcement perspective, and it's one that's very hard to understand. But Michael Sheehan hit on it when he said that the way you respond to an attack has everything to do with how you actually make yourself safer in every way, both in terms of who you are as a nation and in terms of what you are doing in terms of military and criminal response. And that is that the justifications of the Bush administration for many of its early detention, interrogation policies, including the setting up and opening of Guantanamo, was the fear of a follow-up attack. And the interrogations often were about, is there going to be a follow-on attack, and what is it going to be? And it was a persistent belief of the Bush administration early on that that would happen. And so there had to be some kind of disconnect between an understanding of al-Qaeda and who they were and how the Bush administration reacted. It wasn't just panic. So I guess my question for you, Mike, and I might want to hear from Phil Mudd on this as well, okay, is has all of this work on al-Qaeda over the past many years put us in a situation where maybe one of the reasons we would react better is that we actually understand a little more? Or do you think that it's really just a general response when you're attacked, you panic, etc.? I mean, was there some legitimacy to the idea that there would be follow-on attacks then, and maybe we've had a learning curve since then?
Let me take a crack at that, Karen. One of the problems of this country in 9/11 is we didn't understand that these people had already been attacking us. We forgot about the August embassy attacks and the USS Cole. Do you know that the third presidential debate of the election between Governor George Bush and Al Gore was conducted 5 days after the Cole's attack, and neither candidate mentioned it? You can Google it, October 17th, 2000. It was extraordinary how much the country collectively was asleep. This is a bipartisan criticism. And the press did neither, nor did the American people. And all the information was out there. It wasn't a lack of information. There was a billion-dollar warship that was sinking in a port. There were 17 sailors that weren't even buried yet. And it wasn't even discussed in a presidential debate. Can you imagine that now? So what happened, we were asleep to the switch. So when 9/11 hit, we overreacted. We thought these people were 10 foot tall. But people who had been at this business a long time, we knew these people. We said, okay, this time, they really pulled it together this time. And they got 4 planes and they killed a lot of people. It was devastating. I was shocked. Everyone was stunned. But for people who had been in the business who had seen them, it wasn't that big of a shock. But for people who had never heard about it again, it seemed like Armageddon was at the door. And we looked in the sky every day after 9/11 for more planes. But they weren't coming, and I knew they weren't coming, because I knew al-Qaeda wasn't that big or that good. So I think it's important to understand the threat. And I think as we understand it better, we'll be able to respond in a better way. And remember, I'm not writing these people off. They're dedicated to killing us in large numbers. They're trying to get access to weapons of mass destruction. We have to stay after these guys for a generation. But at the same time, we just have to take a deep breath and understand their limitations as well as their deadly intent. And I think it'll inform our response, whether it be in human rights and whether it be in how we conduct ourselves afterwards in terms of our economy, in terms of our responses. So I think more knowledge is a good thing, and I think our people will handle it better.
If we had on this panel a prosecutor or a defense attorney that had been involved in the trials of the embassy bombings cases or several other terrorism cases from prior to 9/11, they would most likely say, and Peter Clark from Scotland Yard would reiterate, that there is an important dimension to public trials for defendants in terrorism cases. And I'm just wondering, I wanted to ask Mitchell Silber this, if he felt that through the New York, and we'll just talk about New York City, not the country as a whole, because this is what you need, that there has been, that whether it's the Herald Square bomber or whatever it is, that there's been an education of the public through these trials, or that there's so much classified about these trials that can't be known, that in a way that public is getting less educated, even if law enforcement is making them safer.
I think it's instructive to look at the UK experience in the sense that they've probably put more people on trial than almost any other country for the al-Qaeda threat. And there are some benefits by going through this process in terms of trying to disincentivize people from going down this track, as well as clear up some of the mystery as to whether this was really a plot or not. And as the evidence is presented in court as to what these individuals were actually up to, it potentially removes maybe the suspicion that the plot wasn't real or something fabricated by the government. So I think in speaking with our British colleagues, they certainly feel that it's beneficial from a counterterrorism perspective to have these trials and have the information in the public domain. That said, given the nature of the threat, to some degree there's one arm behind their back, because there is a certain component of the information that's secret and can't be revealed. If you look at the overt trial from the last month or two, al-Qaeda is not even mentioned in the British prosecution. And obviously the questions are as to whether there are intelligence reasons why that couldn't be so. So I think overall it's definitely beneficial to have that out there. It removes the mystery as to whether this plot was real or not, and there's nothing like seeing sort of just the facts, ma'am.
I have a question for all of you, so you can answer it briefly, and then we'll have audience questions, so get your questions ready. And it has to do with something Michael Sheehan referred to at the very end of his talk. He didn't quite use this word, but it seemed to me what he was talking about, which is a lack of leadership, or the need for very strong leadership when it comes to matters of terrorism and counterterrorism, and what we've called the costly, I think as Suzanne Spalding said earlier, the costs of our war on terror. And so I'm wondering if each one of you could just take a few moments to answer the question that Mike answered in his talk, which is, what is it we need from a new president that will make this a little bit easier in terms of bringing together the country as we approach an era of sustainability rather than emergency in matters of terrorism and counterterrorism? And we're going to just go from left to right. So, Joe, we're going to start with you. Sorry.
Well, I will try not to get too political here. Coming from my perspective on the Human Rights and the Law Subcommittee, I do think that we need to see a return to some of the values that have guided us in past conflicts, a return to respect for our treaty obligations, particularly the Geneva Conventions. And I think many would argue that in addition to being more consistent with our values, our Constitution, our law, that it would be helpful in restoring our image around the world. And just to pick up on your previous question, Karen, the fact that 7 years after 9/11, none of the planners of the 9/11 attacks have been brought to justice is not fair to the families' victims, and additionally makes it much more difficult for us to make the case around the world about the threat that al-Qaeda poses. And, you know, the administration came to Congress after 9/11, and they had a very receptive audience. They moved the authorization to use military force through Congress very quickly with only one dissenting vote in the House. They passed the Patriot Act by an overwhelming bipartisan vote. If they had come to Congress and asked for authorization for military commissions that were consistent with the Geneva Conventions, maybe departed in some respects from our Uniform Code of Military Justice, there would have been overwhelming support for doing so, even with some accommodations for national security issues. But they didn't do that, and instead the Supreme Court has 3 times rejected the system that they have in place, and as a result we find ourselves where we are today. So I hope that there'll be a new path in a new administration.
Mr. Mudd?
2 quick comments. The first, I remember sitting at the table after 9/11 with former CIA Director Tenet, who had what are now famous 5 o'clock meetings. That was a very inefficient. We were very inefficient as a community then. We're a lot more efficient now, and we have a ways to go. The first of 2 things I'd say is learn from those efficiencies and keep practicing, bringing the community together and forcing efficiencies on it. We're going to be at this a long time. We've gotten better, and so listen to people like me. Okay, the second is I think it's really nice to be in my position and watch debates on things like the economy, on policy with China and Russia, to watch my niece walk down the street and feel safe in some ways from a terrorist attack in Charlotte, North Carolina. But this is a really inefficient campaign against an adversary that will be around for many years. One thing I'd say is please allow these national debates to take place on other issues. We shouldn't have to worry about terrorism every day, but behind the scenes, if you don't pay attention to this in terms of organizational structures, getting bureaucracies to work together, funding state, local, federal law enforcement, funding intelligence, hammering our liaison partners overseas who have a very mixed approach to this problem, we're not going to be able to maintain momentum. We have a long way to go.
I think in terms of, from the perspective of a local police department, the costs are literal in terms of asset allocation, resource allocation, and financial costs. The New York City Police Department has allocated approximately 1,000 people to counterterrorism and intelligence efforts. And this is something that didn't have to be done or wasn't done before 9/11. So that really, it's a toll on the department, it's a toll on the city, and there's a significant portion of that that's really, funded by the city and the department in and of itself, and developing that expertise to be effective in this area. So I'd say those are some real costs for New York City.
Michael, Sheehan.
All the bureaucrats in Washington will hate me for this, but I think this effort has been completely, totally overfunded. I believe that most of the damage done to Al-Qaeda was done in the first 2 years after 9/11, and all of the hundreds of billions of dollars that were spent on this take at least 2 or 3 years to get through the pipeline. So most of the good work was done with assets who were in place on September 10th. And what we lacked was leadership and focus. And basically, you had to enable the people within the government to do what they did. We didn't need any extra funding on September 11th to take down Afghanistan. As Hank Crumpton said, basically 400 Americans were in Afghanistan in December of 2001. And, of course, the U.S. Air Force overhead is pretty significant as well. I believe that most of the work in 2002 and 2003 done by the CIA and the FBI, the two leaders of this effort, were done with people and budgets that were in place on September 10, 2001. Now, since then, the size of the bureaucracy has basically doubled. And I'm just not sure that's been a great, I think the amount of waste in that is just extraordinary. At NYPD, by the way, it has been a toll for NYPD, 1,000 cops out of about 37,000 put into counterterrorism. But at NYPD, we don't have a printing press up there. So of dollars. Mayor Bloomberg and Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly took it out of Hyde. What they did was they set priorities. Okay, we're going to do something about counterterrorism, we're going to get it done, and we're just going to have to cut something else. And they were under enormous pressure to reduce crime and to police the city. But you got to set priorities, and I think we've kind of gotten away from that in Washington. When you have a new mission, you just throw another couple hundred, 700 billion at it. We're immune. When I was in government last, in federal government 8 years ago, $1 billion program was really big. Now, if you're not talking hundreds of billions, you don't even get anyone's attention. I think it's time to kind of look not first at throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at a program, but figuring out what needs to be done and committing the leadership, the focus, and the creativity to the problem rather than $100 billion price tags.
Mark Sageman.
All right. Leadership. I think leadership is to lead.
Mike, can you turn on his thing?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, leadership, it's to lead, and leading should be based on understanding. And so what we said before, we have to really understand the enemy, we have to understand the behavior of the enemy. But to lead, you have to resist the temptation to use whatever issue you're using for political gain. And let me just point out, not just this country, but elsewhere, terrorism is really used to terrorize their own population. If you have the government of Morocco, the Casablanca bombing was a tragedy. 15 bombers, maybe 30 people supporting them. They arrested and convicted 2,100 people. They had an agenda to use that issue. So you have to forego the gain that the political gain that you want, whether it's the invasion of Iraq that had nothing to do with the original terror threat. But in order to do that, you actually have to educate the public. You can't really take just a poll and kind of go along and fuel almost the politics of fear. You have to educate the public. The old fireside chat that FDR had was an attempt to educate the public, and I really don't see any of that right now, but that's really what's missing. And then, of course, you have to rally the public, that's the third prong, for an effective response. And by effective response, you don't make the problem worse than what it is. And very often, an ineffective response, when you overshoot, you panic and you cause far more damage, you often make the problem much worse because many people rally to the bad guys. And so leadership, to me, understanding, educate the public, and lead it for effective response.
Okay, thanks. All right, it's time for your questions. Peter?
Yeah, I had a sort of follow-up to a question that Karen asked, and it's probably best answered by somebody who's not serving in the government, but do a little cost-benefit analysis of having a trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11, in the Southern District of New York, as opposed to in a military tribunal.
Mike, you want to take that one on? Being both military and...
I think it would be great if we tried him in the Southern District and put him in jail, let him rot for the rest of his life, or give him the death penalty, whatever way it goes. I'm not against the death penalty. Some people may be. In New York, it's a federal crime, so I guess they'd be subject to it. But I think it would be great to try him. I think we should. I would even, if we captured bin Laden, I'd want to drag him back and try him. And I think we could try KSM now without having to get into some of the more sensitive documents that they don't want to get into. There's so much evidence against him. It should be an easy case. So I wish they would do it, and I don't know why they're not, but they must have their reasons.
Philma, do you want to respond?
Just one quick comment. I'm not sure I have a view on a military tribunal versus New York, but I think a trial is a good idea. These folks are criminals. They're not heroes. They murdered 3,000 innocents. There are kids out there who will never see their parent again. I don't believe in the death penalty in this case because they get what they want. Try them as criminals, talk about them as criminals. They're not jihadists. They want to be known that way. They're not terrorists. They want to be known that way. That is glorifying them. They are common chump change criminals, and they ought to be tried as such.
Other questions? Over here. Wait for the microphone, please, and identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is... My name is Philip Smucker. I'm the author of Al-Qaeda's Great Escape, and I'm a freelance journalist. And for Ambassador Sheehan, I just wanted to ask you, because you didn't include the number of dead Americans in Iraq, and that only raises my question, what are we doing to measure the blowback, the training they've gained, the credibility they've gained across the Islamic world from their actions in Iraq, and will we be looking forward to a blowback of some nature from our engagement in Iraq?
In 2005, 2004, 2005, when I was at NYPD, I was predicting a blowback from Iraq. It made sense that there would be. I was concerned that there were a lot of operatives there, that the people were angry around the world. The fact of the matter is there hasn't been. And so I've been scratching my head for a while trying to figure out why hasn't there been a blowback from her. What is going on in Iraq? Why haven't they been able to export that? Why hasn't there been any blowback? And why is another thing that I just can't understand about Iraq is why has there not been one single American found either going to Iraq, coming back for Iraq, or in Iraq? Or even a North American from Canada. Although one person told me that Zarqawi had one Canadian computer guy in his staff, but otherwise there's virtually none from the Western Hemisphere that's firing foreign fighters in Iraq. The Iraqi phenomena has been very local. It hasn't really expanded beyond Iraq. Zarqawi tried to. He took it to Jordan with a couple attacks there. We blew up a wedding and killed an AID guy. But they really haven't been able to export it. I don't think it's because they don't want to. Al-Qaeda definitely wants to export terrorism out of those theaters. But for some reason, there hasn't been a lot of flow from there. It's mostly local. There are locals coming in there. And they're all Arab, by the way. There's very few non-Arab fighters in there, unlike Pakistan and Afghanistan, where they're multinational. They're mostly Arab and they're mostly local. And they haven't been able to export it. I'm very surprised that they haven't been. It's been 5 years now, and they haven't been able to do that. So the blowback that I predicted hasn't quite happened. And by the way, they had plenty of things to be angry about when they blew up our embassies, when they blew up the coal, and they blew up 9/11, which was pre-Iraq. So it doesn't seem like they have a shortage of things to be mad at. So the anger factor, I don't know, it's kind of a wash for me. They've always been angry, these groups. But what's really been fascinating to me is their lack of ability to export out of there, and also their difficulty in exporting even out of Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Interesting. Yeah.
Pam Benson from CNN. This is, I think, directed primarily at Phil Mudd, but maybe the NYPD people want to respond. This morning, Fran Townsend and I think one other panelist mentioned that there's been a pattern just before elections or just after elections of attacks. You look at London, you look at Madrid, even the 2 World Trade Center attacks happened shortly into new administrations. How concerned are you? Are there any indications right now that there's an effort or desire by Al-Qaeda or its wannabes to do such an attack? What's the threat assessment over the next few months?
Can you turn the cameras off, please? Peter, I'm going to kill you, by the way, afterwards. I have not been an issue, but a weapon by the FBI, and that's a good thing for you. I think this group attacks when it has the capability to attack. I think there are a few instances of timing. For example, Madrid is a good example. But I agree with Mike. If they had the capability to attack in this country, they would. These are a committed group of people. So, I don't want to sound too facile here, but there may be timing calculations in their minds, but I think this is largely capability driven. If they get the chance to get here with operatives who can attack, they'll do it. So, I want to, as an analyst, I want to complicate the answer, but I'm just struggling to do so.
I'm sorry to tell you this, but we are, unfortunately, out of time. Let me just say that last time we did this, we went till, I think, 6:30 or 7 o'clock, so it may seem like a long day to you, but it's a less long day to us. I think the final words on this panel, the takeaway is make sure that the next time we don't panic, but we never forget to pay attention. So Steve Clemons will conclude. Thank you.
Stand right here. Stand right here. Peter, Karen, come up. Before we thank everyone, I just want to say first of all of you deserve a great prize. I wish, like at the end of a marathon, we had a medal to put around your neck. Look at this fantastic room. A lot of stuff has been heard in this room over the years, and it's a great place to be. The New America Foundation loves our relationship with the Center on Law and Security at NYU. 1 week from today, again, October 17th, in New York, we'll be having a similar program on Afghanistan, sponsored by both of our organizations. I want to really thank Karen, who's done an outstanding job on phone, and Peter Bergen, who is the mastermind, who has the seriousness and gravitas to convince Mike Sheehan to be the last speaker on the last panel, the last day. It's a great pleasure to have everyone here. I want to say a few things before I thank some folks and thank our panel. First of all, I want to thank C-SPAN, who's also been with us live all day today. C-SPAN has changed its format so that the moment this is over, you can actually go on to C-SPAN and you can go back and look at a recording and watch it at will anytime. And you can go back and look at it. The Washington Note and the New America Foundation have been streaming this all day. We're snipping it up so that you can watch, Mike Sheehan's panel, and then you can watch Fran Townsend's panel and not have to watch 9 hours all at once. But we've had over 10,000 people come through some part of the day over the Ustream on the live stream. I just got the numbers from our technical staff. And again, keeping Mike Sheehan up here because I know he's the reason why you're all here. I want to thank Senator Chuck Hagel again. He was our host in this. He's not going to be in the Senate much longer. This was one of the, he's got a couple of months left, but it was very, very nice that he and his staff, many of whom have been here today, made this available to us, particularly Katie Ringenberg and Rex Yu and Mike Buttry in Senator Hagel's office. And the Senate staff here, it's kind of cool to feed people at their seats. We got away with some things we shouldn't have. So Barbara, Howard, Tuddy, thank you. You know who you are. Peter Bergen, Steve Call of our office, Patrick Doherty, Sam Sheridan, Ben Katcher, Catherine Tiedman, Brian Till, Faith Smith, Liz Wu, Aaron Drankowski, Mike Jones, Kate Brown, and Troy Schneider, and Doha, Yiching, Chris, Tim, Alex, and Josh. Because they actually, when they were shoving you, it wasn't just me shoving you out into the hall. It was, they all helped, and I appreciate it. I want to thank Philip Mudd. Mark Sageman, Mitchell Silber, Mike Sheehan, and Joe Zogby. Thank you so much for hanging with us this day. And I think we've accomplished a great deal. So formally, this meeting is adjourned. Enjoy. Now you can rush the front.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, tremendous.